Hi guys, Olive here. Here today with the next installment in my ongoing series of videos all about the 90s PBS Kids TV show, Wishbone. Just in case you've never seen an episode of Wishbone before, I will tell you that it was a half-hour television program for children, and each episode had two different storylines going on at the same time. The first storyline was always an adaptation of a work within the literary canon, and the second storyline focused on a family living in Texas with their pet, Jack Russell Terrier Wishbone, and these two storylines always spoke to one another thematically. In this series of videos I do here on my channel, I look at one episode of Wishbone per video and I compare it against its source material. What did the writers choose to include? What did they choose to exclude, and why? I look to see if they pulled any kind of a moral message out of the source material to communicate to the very young audience of this show, and then finally I ask the most basic but the most important question of all: was it an entertaining episode? In today's video, I'll be looking at a mid-season 1 episode of Wishbone that takes on the classic work of science fiction by H.G. Wells, The Time Machine, and this episode is titled Bark to the Future. Let's take a look. What's the story, Wishbone?
What's the story, Wishbone? What's this you're dreaming of?
At the top of this episode, Wishbone is contemplating the concept of time, but only as it applies to when he can have his next treat. And it's around this time that Joe and his friends return home from school looking glum. Joe got a C- on his latest math test, and he wants to turn his grade around, but he said he never has enough time to finish the math tests because they're so challenging. David suggests he use a calculator, and he actually lets Joe have his spare one, telling him, "Welcome to the future." Wishbone uses this machine of the future to introduce this episode's literary inspiration, The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, in which an unnamed time traveler, played by Wishbone of course, uses what he calls a time machine to travel over 800,000 years into the future. When he arrives, he's greeted by a tranquil, uncurious race of humanoids who seem very foreign to the Victorian-era scientist. Back in Texas, the kids are finishing up a math class when Joe asks if he can use his new calculator on the upcoming test. The teacher confirms that, yes, he can use a calculator to check his work, but it's only a tool. And students who rely too heavily on tools tend to become lazy and let their minds go soft. The teacher compares the mind to a muscle, saying that if you don't challenge it, it weakens. Joe doesn't seem to take that advice to heart, binging a TV show after school rather than studying for that upcoming test. In the future, the time traveler gets to talking to one of the members of that pink human race, and he finds out from her name is Weena, that these creatures never get sick, they never fight wars, and they don't work. Weena agrees to show him around, beginning with a library that obviously fell into disuse long ago. Weena doesn't even know how to read. When the two get back from their little adventure, they find that the time machine has been taken by the other species in this future age, the subterranean Morlocks. Weena and the time traveler scavenge an old museum to find light-creating tools to defeat the Morlocks, since those creatures cannot tolerate light. Joe is getting ready to take his next math test, feeling confident with the help of his calculator, when he makes a terrifying discovery. He lost his calculator, and as a result, he doesn't do well on this math test either, deeply concerning his mother. Joe wants a new calculator so he can hopefully bring up his average in the class, but he doesn't have the money for a new one. So his mom suggests that he help out their neighbor Wanda at her yard sale over the weekend. Joe works as the cashier, forcing him to put those math skills to the test using a good old-fashioned pad and pencil. Meanwhile, the time traveler and Weena fight off the Morlocks, and our hero is able to recapture his machine, make his way home, only to depart once more, leaving behind only a strange flower that Weena had gifted him. And in Texas, Joe makes a good commission from that yard sale, and even though he can now afford a new calculator, he's not even sure he needs one because he got so much good practice from being the cashier at the yard sale. So when Wishbone does return the calculator that he actually hid, the difference is apparent on Joe's next test grade. So let's talk about this episode. First and foremost, this was a really ambitious novella for them to take on. I mean, there's the concept of time travel, and they do talk about some of the more technical details of it in the literary adaptation portion of this episode, but also the more political and economic themes within this story and the darker elements of this story. But I do think they pulled it off, more or less. I also have to say that I quite liked the central moral message that they pulled out of the time machine and placed into both of the storylines, and that's the idea that tools are there to help us, but our minds are the sharpest tools of all. And if we are turning to tools, sometimes the simplest ones are the best ones. For the time traveler, that was a torch, and for Joe, that was a pencil and paper. I also really like that they used that central moral message to hint at some of the larger themes present within the novella. We get a taste of those in the show, but obviously the book goes a lot more in depth. But for instance, the Eloi, that pink humanoid race that we meet in the show, the time traveler in the book definitely notices how childlike they are. And he hypothesizes that since there aren't any real external threats to them, they don't go to war, they don't get sick, they don't have any natural predators, they've kind of degraded over time and become what they are. There's nothing that's forced their minds to stay sharp. But there are some things from the book that this show definitely did not touch on, like any of the below ground infrastructure of the Morlocks and how hard they have to toil in order to make that carefree lifestyle of the Eloi up on the surface of the earth possible. So basically a division between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, those political overtones that I was mentioning earlier. The show also doesn't mention that the Morlocks have run out of food and are now eating the Eloi. That is to say that the show's version of this story is a simplified version of this story, but that is normally the case with these Wishbone episodes. They can't include everything for a variety of reasons, so I'm always looking to see whether or not they captured the spirit of the source material, and I definitely think they did in this case. I think they gave you a sense of it. They included all the major plot points. They really gave you a feel for what reading the novella will be like should you go on to read it. I did really like this episode. I liked how much the two different storylines had to do with one another. They definitely felt like two parts of one whole, which is always what I'm looking for. And I thought it was really entertaining. I thought the 90s storyline was highly relatable with Joe's struggles in math class. Who amongst us hasn't had struggles with one class or another? So I feel like we can all relate to that. I did have to laugh, though, because I remember being in school in the 90s. It would have been a few years after Joe and company made their way through school. I'm a few years younger than their characters. But I remember teachers saying at that time, don't rely on the calculator because you won't always have one in your pocket. Fast forward 25 years later, and pretty much all of us have smartphones in our pockets. Calculator available at all times. My, how the world changes. So overall, I thought this was a really good episode. I really liked all the 90s nostalgia, as I always do when I watch this show. Particularly loved that yard sale. Oh, that really took me back. I thought it had two really good storylines that complemented each other very nicely. It was very faithful to the source material. It had a smart moral message. I'd give this one a solid A-. just like Joe got on that last test. So those are my thoughts on this episode of Wishbone. If you have any comments or questions, I'd love to hear from you in the comments section below. And if you'd like to watch more episodes of What's the Story Wishbone like this one, I will link the playlist for you in the description box below. And at the bottom of that description box, you will find links to everywhere you can find me around the internet in case you would like to keep up with what I am reading and writing about right now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.
Funding for Wishbone provided by annual financial support from PBS viewers like you.